Okay, here we go. Thanks very much for your patience. My name is Steve Thomforde, and I'm a senior ecologist with Stantec. And I'll be presenting my co-presenter here with Dan MacSwain. Dan,
Yeah, Dan MacSwain, I'm a natural resource coordinator with Washington County, so I'll be providing some examples of some of the concepts and that Steve talks about earlier on.
okay, and our title is kind of non-chemical habitat installation and management and tactics. And so we will go into it right now. So the outline that we're going to kind of cover here today um, is the background on disturbance processes. We're going to talk about like catastrophic regime shifts and understanding the importance of disturbance in creating and sustaining plant diversity. And we're going to really talk a lot about haying and grazing and fire to shift prairies or any ecosystem restoration into desirable configurations. And we'll kind of talk about as we've experimented along some of our successes and failures. So the scientific framework, I'm going to start out with just introducing some scientific framework, and I think that's really important. Um, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's just a bunch of theory," but theory is very, very important. Theory, framework, concepts, because it allows us to make prediction. And I think a lot of times that we don't have enough of these concepts or stories or narratives or frameworks, whatever you want to call them, to help us think through what's going on here. And I know that's been I've heard that from others in learning theory that we're very heavy on facts in our current human world, but we really lack in principles for thinking. So I'll start out and introduce some principles for us to think. Um, and we're really I'm really thinking that we need to, after 30 years of doing restoration, I really think that we need to shift our narrative from kind of a command and control, like we know better than nature, chemical warfare I have up there on the slide, to restoring those keystone processes and those reciprocal relationships, just very much like what Diane was saying earlier. So why do we need so many chemicals? And I'm not really sure if this is going to be correct or not, but I think it's really a lack of scientific understanding and basic ecological foundations that we have. Um, and it's easier to spray chemicals than think about what's really going on here. And we also are surrounded by myths. And I've come to the conclusion quite some time ago that the whole concept of invasive species, almost like what Diane was talking about, is definitely a myth. And these species are better thought of as being symptoms of compromised ecosystems. And you know what's really interesting? The very first definition from the originator of this, Mr. Charles Elton, 1958, that was his definition of an invasive species, something that comes to be in compromised ecosystems. And I'll come right out, I am a licensed pesticide applicator. I use herbicides very limitedly. And it's not even like I'm trying to avoid them consciously. It's like, to me, it doesn't even make sense to use them except for maybe one or two different situations. Like, okay, now we'll use herbicides now, but it's not the first line of defense. And I was just thinking this through the other day. It's like, you know what? That's like one of the last things I actually go to. So I still use them. But I just talked to a crew member the other day, and they told me that they're really becoming disillusioned by the whole restoration thing, because all we do in the summertime is spray all day long with a 5-gallon pack on their back, dripping all over them, the fumes and everything. So I'm going to borrow from, I love this line, decolonize your mind. It's a friend of mine told me that one time. And I'm going to use these three people to help us think about what we're doing before we get into it. And C.S. Halling, Keystone Processes and Resilience, and Robin Wall Kimmerer, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, Reciprocal Relationships, and Mr. Howard Odom on Autocatalytic Feedbacks. And I'll start with Halling. And Halling said there's two major drivers in declines of ecological integrity in areas we manage for nature. And the first one is the loss of a keystone process, and the second one is social myths. And this is the highest level of thinking. And I think I read this like 10 years ago. And since that time, it's like, yeah, this works every time. So when you really want to get into the contextual level of thinking and then work your way down instead of working down at the chemical, how many ounces per acre do I need to kill species X? It's like, why is species X here? And it's either a loss of keystone process, social myth, or both at the same time. And as I thought about what is a keystone process, usually by keystone species, and I'm glad to see there's other talks about that today. I saw in the not the narrative, but the chapter for the presentation, many words spoke about keystone species, but I think the keystone process Holly's talking about is typically biomass reduction or harvest. And this came in two ways, through food webs and through fire. And that inspired nutrient cycles. Without without biomass harvest, there's no nutrient cycles. And without nutrient cycles, there's no ecosystem services are good. When you think about every single ecosystem service and good, it is a manifestation of nutrient cycles. Healthy, highly evolved, highly structured nutrient nutrient cycles, usually inspired by food webs. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And then social myths. And Holling said that we're surrounded by social myths. And I put one up there that I think everybody here might agree. Fire is bad. I threw another one out there, invasive species, and then I threw the word forest up there, and then grazing's bad too. So just some things that to think about social myth. You may, like 2 years down the road, you'll be driving down the road one way, and all of a sudden you'll come up with a social myth that you actually believed in. And like Leonard Cohen says in his anthem, that's the crack where the light gets in. And it's so invigorating and creative when a paradigm that you held true all of a sudden is shattered right in front of you. And I hope I have many more incidents in my life of that. So, Kimmerer, traditional ecological knowledge, reciprocal relationships, and how people have cared for the land for thousands of years. And so, a lot of my approach is like, how have people cared for the land for thousands, even maybe in Africa, 1 million years, and in Europe, 300, 400,000 years? It's really, really interesting to think about. And maybe that's our model of restoration instead of, again, thinking that we know better than nature. And I have a simple food chain web down here. And the sun feeds the plant, and the plant feeds the bison, and the bison feeds the human being, or whatever carnivore is the carnivore of the day. And those reciprocal relationships from an energy point and from Robin Kimmerer's point, basically the blue arrows. Humans give back to the land to care for the bison, and typically it's fire to create more edible vegetation for themselves and for the animals they love, as Barry Lopez would say. And the bison is grazing out trees and shrubs that would basically dampen out its edible vegetation. It's redistributing nutrients around. It's even in big giant herds of bison coming through the landscape. Is probably what biennial species like black-eyed Susans preferred. I once plowed a prairie that I had planted, and 2 summers later I was harvesting black-eyed Susan seed. It was that thick, and I thought, oh my God, that must be a buffalo stampede mimic. So these species literally had to take care of the source that was feeding them. And Howard Odum took reciprocal relationships and put it into mathematical formulas based on the second law of thermodynamics, which Einstein said would never fall, and he just called it autocatalytic feedbacks. And he's trying to show all of us ecologists that we need to have these reciprocal relationships. And he said so beautifully, systems that evolve these reciprocal relationships persist, while those that do not persist. And so I ask you in the rest of the program, what are we doing in restoration? And is literally restoring food webs the new restoration metric? Something to think about. So here's current restoration right now. And it's really focused on plant species, good or bad, and not species processes, and not those reciprocal relationships. I had to look up that music and Apocalypse Now, thinking about Robert Duvall and the Walk of the Valkyries when the helicopters come flying over. And I can almost hear that. Here we were spraying out cattails. And historically, these would have been grazed out by bison herds about every 15 years during the drought cycles. And historically, it was highly edible, but now it's completely toxic. And I think one reason that we have zero muskrats, they've all disappeared, functionally extinct organism. They're still around, but functionally they're extinct, is the nitrogen poisoning that's in these systems right here. a lot of what we do and a lot of what I do, I consider gardening with native plants and not really restoration. And I've gardened with native plants since the 1990s. I plant all over my lawn everywhere, and I love my lawns and stuff like that. But I'm trying to instill or have you think, at least consider that without restoring these keystone processes and reciprocal relationships, that we really aren't doing restoration and that these systems will not persist at this point. We need those relations to come by. I've even convinced myself that if I'm a paleo indigenous person, and my great, we were all indigenous someplace. And so I always think this is in our DNA still. But if, 10 years, 20 years ago, I would have looked at this. Oh, look at that great prairie restoration. That's so beautiful. But if I was a paleo Arctic hunter walking through this with my family, I'd be like, no signs of animals, no trails, no dung, no grazed patches. Land's no good. We must keep walking. So it's just a different way of looking at what we're actually doing. And the myths, like Holling said, invasive species, are they the cause of ecosystem collapse or are they symptoms of the collapsed ecosystem? And I'm definitely on the number two side. Absolutely, 100%, at least 95% of the time. And I really think that 95% of all the invasive species, whether it's jumping worms, a big-headed carp, or cattails or buckthorn, are driven by excess nitrogen. And we would be better to understand these species as symptoms of excess nitrogen or some other compromise in that ecosystem that has allowed these species to persist. My first hint at this, several things in the field with manure piles. I grew up on a farm. It's like, oh my God, look at the weeds around them. No wonder they call it salt, this salt, type situation. But in 2001, I read the last chapter in Curtis, Vegetation, Wisconsin, the classic book, and he's got prevalent species of weed communities in southern moist nitrogen-rich soils. And I'm reading those and I'm like, oh my God, all those plants I consider invasive. And in 1959, John's saying, no, 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 it's just nitrogen. That's why they're there. And he listed 132 species in Wisconsin that their primary inclusion to any plant community was nitrogen. So it's just really kind of an interesting concept like that. Here's some of your classics: buckthorn, nightshade, garlic, mustard, motherwort, burdock. And here's some leading indicators. These are all native, and they're trees in this case, primitive trees in many senses. But these are kind of indicators of how you are getting closer to the edge of the cliff, and buckthorn is on its way behind you. So and so yeah, it's just kind of interesting. Not all species are created equal. Here's 152 reviewed papers that I use when I talk about nitrogen or write about nitrogen, and I haven't updated this in a couple of years, and I hope it's catching back on here in the United States. You know where this all came from was Minnesota. In the 1980s and the 2000s, Dave Tillman and his students up at Cedar Creek Reserve started adding nitrogen to these prairie plots, and lots of good papers, lots of good papers. But why we don't talk about it, I'm not really sure. Because I suppose it's easier to use a chemical instead of think about it. And if we are treating the symptoms, the invasive species with this case, and not the causes, let's say it is the excess nitrogen in this case, then we're just holding the system in epidemic. By treating symptoms and not causes, we hold the system in epidemic. Classic Holling right there. And I think this comes from a belief system of Western science, and I'm trained in it. I got my biology degree, and I was biology teaching and stuff like that. But I kind of rendered that down that we are more clever than millions of years of coevolution. This is kind of what Western science has taught us. We can find a pill or a chemical to fix anything we want, the perfect seed mix to prevent. And this reductionist form, it's good for getting people onto the moon, right? You got three moving bodies: Earth, moon, and the spaceship. You can do that math on your phone. But we are in evolving, dynamic, emerging properties. If we were to predict accurately in an ecosystem or an economic system or a social system, our models would have to be updating faster than the speed of light. Einstein said that's not possible. Point taken. Exactly. So we really have to humble ourselves back and really like, okay, what is going? Let's try this. Let's try this. The whole concept of adaptive management came out of that. Another Holly. Let's take a look at some of the results that I'm looking at right here and just try to drive this home a little bit more. Here's the Minnesota River Valley in 1910. I grew up very close to here, so I ran back in 2023 and took a picture about right where I think that picture is at. The picture on the left is kind of looking off to Shakopee, Minnesota, just to get some reference of where you're at in there. That was a native pasture for 12,000 years. And the one on the right has been a wildlife refuge for 60. My dad was prominent in helping get that wildlife refuge established. And so I'm not knocking the system at all like that. I'm just saying this is our paradigm kind of situation. The one on the left, people have managed that landscape, or I don't like the word management. I will say they've cared for that land to enhance native food webs, native fibers, native medicines, what inspired those nutrient cycles and ecosystem services and goods for 10,000 years. The one on the right has been managed for wildlife for 60 years, and there's literally no wildlife in the wildlife refuge. So what happened? We took out those keystone processes, biomass harvest, biomass reduction, and one was the herbivores. And when we removed the herbivores, we starved the fire sticks. The cultural fire was starved into reservations, just like that. So it's a 1-2 slab. No more herbivores, no more fire, and that's the result on the right-hand side. The settler farmers with their cattle maintain that in a semi-prairie savanna situation, but when Bloomington removed those and replaced it with a wildlife refuge, that's the outcome we got. Just kind of interesting. Here's the bottom of the hill. Those are all native plants, right? But look at the bare soil. There's nothing edible. I mean, those plants are barely edible, fast-growing, weeding. Look at all the decomposition. If there was fires going through here, people dragging that off for firewood, that would not be there. And so we are really in a catastrophic state, or a life forbidden zone, as C.S. Holling would call it. And just quick example, nitrogen is coming into the atmosphere on the left-hand side at 3% historically. Okay, that's what it was when some of you guys were kids. Okay, 3% input every year. If we remove the herbivores, you can see the nitrogen is now cycling around and around through the food webs, very complex. If we remove the herbivores, the whole system collapses. Now nitrogen, due to burning fossil fuels, carbon in the atmosphere, but we're not even thinking about the nitrogen that's coming into our soils, rivers, lakes, and oceans. Now the nitrogen is coming in at 10%, and regurgitating is the best word I can come up to, back in of itself. And in 10 years, you got 100% increase of nitrogen in the soils. And that the vegetation that replaces it, or even the edible vegetation that was there with high nitrogen, becomes toxic. We can't even put animals back into that system. So it is a catastrophic regime shift, and that's our solution. Oh, I know. We'll just put some Garlon 4 on that. That'll fix it. It's like, okay. So anyways, lots of keystone species cause food webs collapse. They cause the nitrogen cycles to collapse. They cause eutrophication, terrestrial eutrophication, which leaks into the rivers and lakes. And I mean, this is a catastrophic regime shift. And I don't know if any people have used this modeling yet, but I'm starting to hear it all over. Catastrophic climate change, catastrophic this, and I'll just reintroduce this to you just quickly. And this is the model, and really some top-notch scientists, from my perspective, ecologists use this. The limnologists, it started with limnology very strongly back in the late 1990s, Martin Shepard, C. Carpenter. Anyways, the functional state is up on the top left-hand corner. We got all the keystone processes right there: fire, grazing animals. The vegetation is basically 100% native. And then if you see number 1, we've got rid of the grazing animals. We get rid of fire. Biomass builds up. Nitrogen builds up at number 3. By number 4, we've got invasive nitrophilic species moving in. And at number 5, we go off the cliff, and we are just in a life forbidden zone. The soils are eroding. Carbon is now going into the atmosphere. Nitrogen is going into the soils. We've reversed the nutrient flows, etc. And just to restore that system, we have to go all the way back to number 8, kind of in the central lower left corner over there. And just for a quick example, this is the healthy condition right here on the level, and we have the carbon fake going into the ground, deep storage. Look at the roots. This is a model. It's a cartoon, as Howard Odom would say, but it would be this model. This picture is capturing 100 pages of text. So just look at the picture and look at the carbon going into the soil. Look at the roots. Nitrogen is being off-gassed in the atmosphere. We have fire and herbivores in the sit. Now let's get rid of those herbivores and the traditional fire. You can see the root mass is decreasing. We see the process of woody encroachment or afforestation moving in upon us. And in the end, we get into this catastrophic afforestation point. Ground layer disappears. And we are just removing the invasive species. So the red circle now in this catastrophic regime shift model, the red circle, remove invasive species, that's where a lot of our restoration has focused. And we set the ball right back on the edge of the cliff and just the slightest puff of wind, and we're right back into the catastrophic state. If you've been doing restoration, I'm sure people in this audience have been doing it long enough to see areas that we spent years in site prep, lots of spraying, lots of fire, lots of seed, lots of mowing, and then we leave it and we come back 10, 15 years later. It's like, oh my God, what happened? It's right back to where it was. That's what happened. We need to focus on number 8 and restoring those keystone processes, or at least mimicking those. So the question is, how did we manage the land? And that. Think of the research there. Think of the 200 careers in academia, and think of all the graduate students and PhDs that could just, dig deep into the history. I was just given a gift tending to the wild over there on the right-hand side, Kat Anderson. That's exactly what she did. California in 1980, she started talking to the elders and learned all these stories, and it's been a great gift. And so Stephen Pyrene and the Fire, Brief History of Fire. And we won't go into fire. That's a whole different presentation, but humans have burned. Now think of this. Humans have burned to provide food, fibers, and medicine and beautiful landscape for thousands of years. Okay. Fire also is a great form of biomass harvest. It reduces system nitrogen. It creates charcoal in the soils. It builds up lots of charcoal and immobilizes nitrogen. Some scientists actually say it created the ice ages, all that charcoal that we're putting in the soils. What are our objectives when we burn? Are we burning the land, or are we doing restoration to provide us food, fibers, medicine, and more than just beautiful landscapes? It's an interesting question to think about. What did it look like when millions of herbivores did graze this land? Again, there's information out there. It's scattered, but I can see some great PhDs or graduate work and professors at universities that really chase this down. You've heard the 1619 project, correct? We need a 1491 project just as well. I'm quickly talking about grazing as one of those keystone processes. There were so many animals on the land at one time, and it wasn't random. Some areas got grazed never. Some areas got grazed all the time. Some were seasonal. Think of the fun in trying to figure that out. It's just wild to think about. I think over the landscape, this is that intermediate disturbance theory, and I'm trying to put successional sears in there. And I think over the landscape, it would balance out that about 40% of your successional sears would be in the middle. And those are the most diverse. They're the most functional. They're the most provisional of ecosystem services. And that's where your ecosystem wants to be. And it's shifting back and forth and back and forth. And the other side of the equation, you got the very early successional right down in the mud hole, type nothing growing there, and balance that out on late succession. Same thing, bare soils, lots of old trees growing there, falling down, ready to burn, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe no more than 10% of your landscape wants to be in old growth, and maybe no more than just that infancy stage. Think if every human alive was 90 years old and older. Tragically, we are really late successional sear oriented. I'm not going to say climax because that includes animals and people into it, but late successional sear. So we might want to think about that. I love this stability. We all know these herbivores pulsed in cycles. Like there was 200 million bison, and then there was only 60 million, and then there was elk, and then the deer, and then the beaver, and then the muskrats. They're all pulsing through these rapid cycles up and down. 2-year cycles for mice and lemmings, and 10-year cycles for bison, or 15-year cycles. We don't know. Again, that's what we need the research on, like here. But look at where Holling put the stability line through there. And he literally said, as we peak up and then crash down, that's what flushes out the pestilence and disease. That's what flushes out the nutrients. That's what helps maintain edible vegetation and maximize biodiversity, resilience, and returns on investment. That's amazing. And just that simple thought of grazing like that, not only just for native areas, but for domestic operations, this would maximize diversity. So Dan and I just talk about, think of the fun things. I'm trying to make, here's a prairie restoration, a right-hand corner up there, zero population. It crashed, and then they slowly build up 3 to 4 years, 3 to 4 years more and more, and then we get these peak populations that create fields of black-eyed Susans. Once they, just stuff for fun to think about. So kind of at the end of the sequence right here, before we shift into tactics, um, I'm saying that we can hay and graze our way out of an invasive species, and we need to shift that management paradigm from command and control to restoring those processes, food webs, nutrient cycles, and our relationships with the land. So with that in mind, Dan, I think, we'll talk about a haying project that Dan and I worked on together here at Quick Lake in Washington County. Do you want to add something here, Dan?
Yeah, Steve, I guess I can introduce this. So,
Hmm.
to integrate part of this process, when it comes to grassland restoration, many of us are doing some cool season grassland conversions where it's cool season dominated, Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, very difficult landscapes to restore. You're dealing with, past legacy, of farming, different practices, and how do you convert that in a way where you're not using chemicals? So this is one of the projects out at Lake Elmo Park Reserve that was part of a Metropolitan Metro Conservation Partners Legacy Grant, and that green box that you see on the screen is an area that Steve worked with where we used the Xerxes soil inversion method as a guideline. So with that, Steve, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is a completely organic install. I think it was like 5 to 8 acres, Dan. And we came into it, and this is kind of the beginning of what it looked like. We burned off the existing thatch, so we did run fire through it. And then we came in with a moldboard plow, and boy, people don't know how to moldboard plow anymore. It's something that people just don't do. But this is literally to flip the soil up. Before herbicide, everybody moldboard plowed. It's interesting. Every farm had a moldboard plow. Now they all got box elder growing up from them in the tree grove. But we moldboard plow, and that's designed to break the roots of these plants. Remember, this is pre-herbicide days. And then we let it sit over winter, and over winter that really, those roots are pretty smashed up, and they're exposed to cold and also losing water and moisture. So we're trying to kill it through the winter. And then the next spring we did plant it, and we got the oats cover crop here. We we just hit like 7 times over. We got a good seed bed. We rolled it with a cultipacker. So we're doing everything right. And we seeded it with a very diverse mix, and we actually used some dense swath seeding where we know places that, oh, these lupins would do really well on this really poor hill, and we just really put a lot of lupins there and other species all around. So we took a lot of time seeding the site. And when you know it, the next year, I'm like, oh my goodness, it didn't work. But Dan and I, we went on with what we're going to do, and so we started haying it. And I wanted to learn the old way of haying, so I actually got a sickle bar mower. I will never do that again. Over 30 acres, but it was a good way to learn how haying works. And that was invented like in the 1870s. It was a whole breakthrough in agriculture. People could sit behind a horse and mow hay. After that, we were cutting it with hand. So I had to use a sickle bar mower one time in my life. And then we raked it, and then we baled it. That's a beautiful. You can see the windrows off in the distance there, and the black-eyed Susans in front along the 30 acres on a 6-foot sickle bar mower. And then we baled it, and we convinced the local farmer to come in and bale it for us. It was no good for hay, and I hate to even say it's haying. It's a biomass removal, and the reason it was no good because it was full of early season, successional season species, of course, of a lot of thistles, as you could see. And I don't want that stuff. And it's like, we know, Paul, we'll still pay you. And so we gave him some good money, and yeah, he came through and hayed it for us. And you can see on the right-hand side, that's where we actually cut. And if you look, you can actually see a row coming right at you, kind of perpendicular, from about the 9 o'clock mark into the 6 o'clock mark, right up in the foreground there. And we took all that biomass off, so there wasn't a biomass decomposition coming. We took in total 44 bales off the site. Those are big bales. They each had about we calculated out about 24 pounds of nitrogen per acre that we came out. And like I said, it wasn't very dense. It was just that weedy first couple of year vegetation type situation. So 24 pounds per acre of nitrogen seems low, but EPA considers 4 or 8 pounds per acre is the critical threshold. If you exceed that, you're in big trouble. And I think that's a way high number. I think it should be down to 4 or 2 pounds per acre. It depends on your soils, obviously, but there's a lot of work to do on that still. And there it is. That's the organic conversion. And Dan took me out there last summer. I'm like, oh, let's go look at this. And I did not want to look at it. And I'm sweating. Dan's going to say, can you do this over for us or whatever? And we get there. And I'm like, no way, what happened? And he said, doesn't it look good? And I'm like, yeah. And there's still thistle in there, right? I mean, I'm not going to be naive about that. Maybe we took a picture of the better spot, but it was remarkable. It was 80% better, just like that, in a year or two. And I think Dan may have burned on that too, but he'll be right back. Um, and so now Dan and I are really inspired about this. And so I've always thought about green oats or milk oats, they call it, when the oats are actually flowering and now they're making their seed and you get the milk out of them like that. Again, I grew up on a farm, so I know what milk oats are. And I always thought, man, would that be good hay if we could cut that? Because when the oats are flowering, the greatest amount of nitrogen is in the oats at that point. So I could cut it and bale that off. Now I got a perfect seed bed that I could easily seed into. And if you had to spray, you could spray right through there after, but just, so I could do both if I had to. But could I do that? And this is the guy right next door to us. And I pulled over the pickup truck and I, Carl, are you making hay out of your green oats? Yeah, my cattle just love it. He's got dairy cows. They just love it. And I go, okay, that's cool. What are you going to do now? Well, I've got old-fashioned alfalfa growing up in here. And why aren't you using the new varieties where you can just seed it and bale it that summer, not wait a whole year with the oat nurse crop? He said, because the thistles get really thick in them. With the oats here, it helps me get the thistles out of there. I mean, there'll be a few, but not that many. So this is the way I prefer to do it. Like, oh man, that's awesome. So thank you, Carl. So, anyways, Dan and I are ready to start doing some milk oats like that and get going. So, with this, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Dan MacSwain, right
Sounds
there.
sounds great. And Steve, I'll just give you the heads up when I'm ready to advance. But
Yep.
just to continue on the concepts that Steve's talked about, many years ago, Steve, when you started presenting at the conference and I started to learn about everything that you're presenting and kind of seeing plants through the lens of nitrogen, like I think one of the things that you reintroduced today was the Curtis's plant list with nitrophiles, nitrophytes, and just kind of as I'm walking through the park system, I mean, that's what I see. I see plants and I think about like, okay, why are they here? What processes are missing? Is it fire? Is it grazing? Is it people just in general, right? And so I started to learn that. Steve was able to start, we were able to work with him out at Lake Elmo Park Reserve and related to that, like, okay, so how do we start actually focusing on nitrogen and thinking about biomass removal and integrating it into the processes we do? So here's an example that I wanted to show nearby Steve's where we had a site, maybe a traditional site preparation, not going as well as we would like, and we also don't have the luxury of starting over. And it's a very highly visible. I'm also the county ag inspector, so noxious weeds, Canadian thistle, like kind of have to do something. I don't have the luxury of other parts of the state where, you can put out the seed and then maybe wait a little bit of time, 4 or 5 years, and then let it flip in that way. So we had to do something, and we decided to try to tackle that nitrogen, and we did a haying at the end of June. It would have been June, right before early July. Captured a lot of that material, made sacrificial piles on site. We also learned from Steve not to use a sickle bar mower, so we were able to get a disc mower, which expedited the process quite a bit. And we still have a lot to learn when it comes to that. But, anyways, we were able to hay it, remove the material, and I wish I would do a better job of taking pictures, but I think sometimes I become too mad at the Canadian thistle or, the issues we're dealing with, and I decide not to take a picture. I regret it because if you look at that bench photo to your right, that entire field was Canadian thistle. And we were able to hay, we put more seed down. We did a targeted spot mow because we just needed one more mow because it did come up again. And then the following spring, we were able to integrate fire, and um, it was pretty crazy just bringing coworkers out, being like, because we struggled with it, because it was like, oh my God, like we need to do something, but we can't do something. Let's try these biomass removal processes to see if we can make it flip, and we did make it flip. So with that, Steve. And then, so here's another one where we're just a non-chemical method being used. So Lori approached with Pollinator Friendly Alliance, like, hey, is there any opportunity to do any restorations out at Cottage Grove Ravine Regional Park? So unfortunately, I only had one site that came to mind, and it was not a great site. It was probably the most challenging site that I can think of. And this is where I was like, well, if we can get it to work here, we probably can get it to work anywhere. And I'm talking, uh, bluegrass, brome, thistle, knapweed, uh, clovers, plus, some salt from snow piles that were dumped in the middle field. Just a very challenging site. So with that, we wanted to try to export nutrients. So we worked with a local farmer, had him disc and plant some sunflowers. Those sunflowers unfortunately did not make it because a army tent caterpillar attacked them. So we had to pivot. So we then went to a cover crop that we seeded, and then the following spring we pivoted to the soil inversion method. And on that site, it's about 9 acres. So if you want to learn more about it, I would just go to the Xerxes Society Soil Organic webpage so you can see the timeline. But basically, it's moldboard plow, disc 3 weeks later, and then seeding. That season, it was probably the worst, and I know Steve talked about this earlier about maybe trying it in fall and letting winter do some of the work for you. Um, but it was very challenging. I think we didn't end up seeding all of it. It was like kind of in waves for like 2 to 3 weeks. And anyways, with that, if you go to the next one. We see it in the spring. It's looking actually, that summer it's looking really good. Everything right next to the trail. We accidentally seeded at a much higher rate, so we were probably at like 15 pounds per acre with that specific mix. And then on the interior, we were more like at 8 pounds per acre, and that's with a Truax seed drill. If you go to the next, the issue. So yeah, was this a success or a f failure? And Steve, I think one picture might not have shown on that. Yeah, right here. This is so was it a success or a failure? Like as you can see in that picture there, it's looking really good next to the trail. But then if Steve, you go to the next one with the thistle, on the interior, it's solid thistle. And, Lori's coming out. Lori, I know you were just as nervous as I was. I was in panic mode, but then it was like, okay, well, let's focus on nutrients. Let's consider removing it. So, Steve, if you go to the next one, that's what we ended up doing. We took the disc mower and we were able to hay the entire site. You can see like the edges are looking really good, a lot of rows, but the interior is not looking as good. But like, how can we just focus um, on the cycle to reduce overall nutrients? So we hayed it. We did some spot mowing. We followed up with a seeding again, and then we spot mowed in June of 2025. And then after that, if you go to the next one, that's what it was looking like. And I will be the first to admit that I did not have patience with this site, and it just completely flipped after a couple of years. Um, I think just kind of long term out there, it'll continue. We need to continue to mimic those biomass removal processes. And it's a challenging site with the utility, and fire can be challenging. But this was, what was a failure, potentially a success moving forward, as long as we're keeping up with that biomass removal. So if you go to the next one.
There we go.
Yeah, with this one, I wanted to show an example of, we are a growing regional park system. So one of the things that we're continuing to do is acquire farmland. And sometimes with that, we don't actually know uh, the pesticide history on the land. And as we all know, there's concerns with residuals on many different pesticides. So we were hesitant in planting it completely over to prairie um, immediately following harvest. So with that, we decided to take our time and we tried to do oats, which failed miserably because we didn't have a high enough rate. And plus, we had equipment issues at the time. And then Lori, with her magical ties and relationships, and we were able to talk to a local farmer and we looked into sunflowers. So we actually planted 18 acres of sunflowers on the site with the idea being, again, we are taking nutrients out of the soil. There's also a crop. There's also an aesthetic beauty um, for park visitors and other wildlife visiting it. And following that harvest, we then chopped it up. And then if you go to the next, we decided, one of the things that I don't know, hopefully you've been able to take away too, that it's not only the processes, but it's like the timing of the process. And one of the things that a lot of people have mentioned through time, just in as far as my time in restoration, is the importance of trying to fall seed. And so we did with our funding partners at South Washington, Pollinator Friendly, Wild Rivers Conservancy, and South Washington to convert 18 acres of cropland that's along the St. Croix River using Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources Pollinator Plot Southeast seed mix. So we planted it in the fall, in the spring, and we wanted to see what happened. So what happened? Was it going to be a failure or success? And Steve? Yeah, I think Lori, if we were maybe thinking it was on the failure side here, and this was in the fall planting. We were walking through it, we were nervous, didn't know if it was a dormancy issue, didn't know if it was a plant too deep issue, didn't know if it was a legacy issue of nutrients in the soil, but we decided instead of jumping to herbicide, we decided that, let's try doing some biomass removal with volunteers and equipment as well, and just add more seed. And so what happened? It turned around. It took time, but it turned around. And I know, there's many, it's very complex on how that switch happens, but this is what it was looking like. And I just wanted to spotlight some data that Tara Kelly from Washington Conservation District was able to obtain. And that was that we were, and I know, and this is also a synthesis. She also had a lot more data related to this, but a couple of things as it relates to forbs was there was more forbs being established in the fall planting and more cover of forbs. Um, so yeah, was it a failure or success? And now we're starting to trend towards the success on this, and um, also hopefully success long term with trying to target more fall plantings when we can.
Very cool.
And then Steve next. Yep. And then okay, so we also, while I did talk about a lot of success, I would say there's a lot of failures that I think it's just kind of importance to at least recognize, and that is like overall, we're still trying to rebuild land stewardship systems, just all of us, and I just kind of wanted to point out some of the failures, and I mean it in a way that's like in a positive way, like, okay, well, this is something big that needs to be worked on in order for us to have these reciprocal relationships with the land. And one of them, so not on here, is fire. Like, I do think, the fire is having a great impact on land. It's probably the most powerful tool that we have in our toolbox on as far as like the impacts it's having on our native plant communities, and like there's just nothing in my eyes that can really replace it. So I just do want to acknowledge that. But I also think about like we're trying to manage land with fire without large animal grazing systems, whether that's the bison or the cattle. And like part of me dreams of the day when we are able to do low intensity fire where animals maybe came through versus burning little blue stem, big blue stem that's like 5, 6 feet tall and can have 24 foot flame lengths. So yeah, it's the absence of large animals grazing in our systems. You know, other thing that is, when you can't graze, maybe fire's not being implemented as much as you'd like, then how do you try to mimic grazing? And typically you need equipment and you need people. And in order to do that, like there also might need to be a market associated with it, but oftentimes it not. So it's not. And there's not a desire for hay. And that's what we've learned through the process of implementing it is that, people aren't really, or farmers aren't as interested in restored prairie that may have some thistle in it, or some wheat canary that's not hayed at the time that they want it for crude protein or anything like that. So it leads to us not being able to hay at a meaningful scale. I do have ideas for improvement on that. Steve, I haven't even been able to talk to you about this, but I was kind of like, well, why don't we integrate our wood waste with silage? And why don't we move towards silage chopper systems versus haying, like just to expedite it so we don't have to send equipment back out into the field. But so anyways, we have maybe fire's not in the landscape as much as we want. We don't have large animals on the landscape. We're not haying, don't have the people to be out there. What does that lead to? It leads to forest. And I would often say it's novel forest. I don't know if Steve, if you would agree on that or not, but um, it's forests that we're not able to improve as much, and it leads to overstocked forest. It leads to us viewing trees as a waste versus something we can use and love. And yeah, it's just this kind of sad system. So, anyways, I do wanted to mention those things that there's a lot more ways to go, and hopefully we can get ideas for others on that biomass removal, incorporating it into your restoration. So, with that, Steve, hand it over to you.
The chopper box sounds like a good idea, Dan. We'll talk about that more. That's great. And yeah, really, really interesting to hear the full story. We practiced this yesterday, but it was really, really good to hear your thinking through this process like this. Yeah, um, just the conclusion, things to consider, and I think both Dan and I are. You can hear Dan talking, you can hear me talking. We're both like, think about it. Think of we don't really know what we're doing, and a failure was not really a failure because we learned so much from it, and we're very much like that. I do some teaching. I still teach, and I just want my students to be inspired to think, and that's what we want to leave you with today. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions here as before you go here. And humans have managed or just some things to think about. Humans have managed natural areas to increase food webs for thousands of years. And just think about that. How can we mimic the way we have been managing landscapes for thousands and thousands and thousands of years? Um, Another take home message might just be we can't spray our way out of these noxious weeds. They will come back sooner or later, but we can hay, graze, or burn our way out. And how can we link this haying and grazing and burning into markets then that help us expand radically, or not radically, but just expand the scope of restoration everywhere? Um, I like to think of this site prep and seeding our restoration. And the next bullet point down, the only thing we can restore or mimic or substitute are these keystone processes. And that is that biomass harvest. And food webs and fire were the big two that really controlled that. And finally, do we need a new metric for restoration? Um, and it might be food web length, and from insects and decomposers, the mammals, the herbivores, the carnivores, to decomposers, the dung piles that create all kinds of insects to feed other birds, and the pollinators just fit in that whole matrix instead of just focusing on flowers per meter like we kind of do now. So those are just things to think about as you go home, and I really appreciate your time today. It was fun talking to you, and reach out if you have any questions. And Dan, if there's anything you want to say goodbye, please do.
Sounds good. Thanks again, Lori.
Well, we have a few questions for you guys if you're up for it.
Sure.
Yes,
You're getting a lot of claps right now, a lot of clapping and a lot of hearts.
I'm doing that. Just
Cheater.
kidding.
So, did you do any soil nutrient sampling at any of your projects over the years?
Well, I did, and that's a really good question, and I think I have pictures of that. We did it in Washington County, Dan, where we first met, and it was really interesting. I have pictures of this that are great. It's an 80-acre area in Washington County, managed by South Washington Watershed District, and it had been restored before I got there. Basically, it had been seeded, and most of it was well, but the lowest spot, and nitrogen is water soluble, so it always is with gravity and water going downhill. The lowest spot was just choked out with these noxious plants and thistles and burdock and things like that. And it had all been planted in prairie. It looked really good, and slowly but surely, within 3 or 4 years, it was completely dominated by the some of the very nasty vegetation, non-edible, so the food webs collapse. And so we measured that soil, Lori, um, and you could literally sometimes these cutoff in these high nitrogen zones are so sharp that you can have 1 foot in the noxious weeds and the other foot in really nice. I mean, that sharp. And in the noxious weed zone, we're coming up with like 365 parts per million nitrogen. And then where the native vegetation was, just I'm going to say 20, 30 feet away, usually a little upslope, you could actually go by the elevation, it was 65 parts per million. So you can see like 6 times higher in nitrogen where those noxious weeds were. So good question.
Yeah, okay. Do you see an expanding role for biochar and getting rid of the removed biomass? And what are the barriers if you think that is important?
I'll let Dan take that one because he's got a lot of biomass sitting right outside his office. What do you think, Dan?
I think there is an opportunity for it. I think the reuse piece has to be figured out a little bit more. Like, how are we going to use that biochar? Because it does take extra time and resources to create it. I think there's a lot of benefits to creating it. It's just like, how are we going to reuse it at scale? Um, and I think there is a way to do it. Like even with our fires right now, I think that's what a lot of people don't understand is like when we are doing our prescribed fires, like we are creating biochar. When that fire is going through, and yes, we're having to do mop up like and spend a long time on logs, like we're creating biochar. So yeah, how do we use biochar? I think that's probably the bigger question. And there's definitely, I think, a lot of opportunities to do so.
Um, and what are your thoughts on goats or sheep as a biomass removal?
Yeah, I think yeah, so goats and sheep, we do a lot of goat grazing in the parks and I for this presentation I decided not to cover goats just because we have presented on that at past summits. Um what was interesting is Steve when you were talking about pl getting the oats and then getting it to the milk stage. Like we've done that with the goats where we've done the cover crop right before leaf out, run the goats through it, and then seed after it. And I always wondered about how much nitrogen we were pulling out with both of those processes being
Yeah.
implemented. But yeah, we've had a lot of success with goats. We use them in more disturbed, degraded systems, not our highly um, intact native plant communities. Just from a, we not from a like I'm not open to it, but we have all these other sites where they're beneficial. So we are using them there. Sheep, we have a project out at Lake Elmo Park Reserve where we're using haying and sheep in a cool season grassland to try to remove nutrients and then interseed into it. So yeah, but it's not the impact of a cattle or bison. So
Yeah, I'll add to that. And The first wave is with the goats, and the goats are more primitive, so they're more adapted to the woody condition, which is a more primitive state actually. And so they're definitely browsers. And I've always said when we move to sheep, we're actually going in the right direction, getting back into more of a savanna-like system. And so Bloomington, and this is a good thing, Dan and I talked about this yesterday. Bloomington is still trying to buy the last farm in Bloomington, which is a sheep farm right next to the Mall of America, and they wrote in their 30-year plans for the River Valley, 9 Mile Creek, that grazing animals will be returned, and they literally are thinking about after we've used goats for a couple, 3 times on the browse, we want to shift into sheep, and that's when we know that we're doing a good job. I'd love to see cattle or bison down there again someday, but these are those little steps. So Bloomington has actually thought about purchasing this farm and turning it into a grazing hub for all of Metro. And if you look at the old pictures, their grazing theater Worth Park in the 1928 Minneapolis Tribune picture. How much are we going to pay the herders this year? I mean, they're literally talking about the Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board in 1928, Washington, D.C., the sheep lawns in New York. Why are we running fossil fuel mowers across large campus lawns and businesses? They should all be grazed, and we should be benefiting from those beautiful products, those reciprocal relationships. So yeah, one other thing, just really quick, like about the woody stuff, biochar. We talked about this with Dan the other day. I worked with a site down in Whitewater Valley, grazing. It was a farmer who wanted to take out some junk trees, make it to free the oaks, and then graze it. And he said he never wants to damage the oaks, and he was because he loves the oaks because his cattle like the oaks, and so it was really a restoration thing. I think it was 7 acres is what it was, and they cut it by hand because it was really steep, and they hauled the logs up. They sold every single log to like 17 different Amish mills in the Driftless area. Each mill took a different type of tree, made a different product, and the farmer didn't cost him a thing. He made like $50,000 on that. The loggers split the money with them, and I mean that's a really cool thing. And then I just heard on Wisconsin Public Radio the other day about a woman in Milwaukee during the pandemic in just a really inner city urban area that she always was so interested in carpentry, and so she started building things in the pandemic, like a table, and posted it, and people liked it. She built another one and started selling them, and now they're taking the waste trees that fall in Milwaukee, the city crews, cutting them down, and they're turning that. They got a sawmill, and they're turning it into lumber, and I think it's She Slings Wood is the website. She's won like some awards for et cetera, et cetera. So those are the things that really will help benefit restoration. Again, now a waste product, a tree laying in the street becomes a useful product for a piece of furniture and jobs and employment. So cool stuff going on, guys.
Yeah, Lori, I want to expand upon that too, because the other thing that I think, when people ask about goats and sheep, for us, we're able to do it at scale, so we get a lower cost per acre for doing it. But there are points at which I wouldn't do it too. But I also want to remind people, like, if you're using a machine, you're kind of grazing, right? It's a form of grazing. Maybe you're not removing the biomass, but like equipment costs money. That's 30,000 for a mower minimum. Tractors, what, 100,000 now? Skid steers, 70,000. So you do have a cost, plus you have fossil fuels that are going into it. So why not grazing? Like, how much is a cow, a sheep, a goat? It runs on the sun, the grass, water, like probably the best machine there ever was.
So this is a related question. If you're removing biomass to get rid of nitrogen, what do you do with the biomass if there aren't animals to take care of it?
Yeah, I mean, Steve, you okay if I take this first?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think we are working on this right now. Like one of the things that we're doing is we're doing sacrificial piles right out on site in a area where it's like, a lot of reed canary or a lot of smooth brome, like just piling it right there because that does take time to haul it off. I think in the dream and where I would like to go is I would like, on that silage chopper, like get it right in the back of a dump trailer and then actually go back. And one of the things that we're doing, or, we're we're taking wood waste, we haul it, we then touch it again, chip it, and then sometimes that chips has to be hauled off site. And so what I'd like to do is start doing, and yes, I know this requires permits, but ultimately start to mix in our carbon with our nitrogen, and maybe we're able to create some soil on site or something like that. But I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in the state on this because so that's a pathway. Another pathway, and Steve, maybe you can talk about this more, is just um, down south, it seems like they value grassland hay, especially with horse operations much more than they do up here. So maybe there's an education aspect of this with grassland managers up here. Steve, additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we talked about this yesterday, Dan, and I've worked to I dream of a prairie hay cooperative where we actually have a branding for people that are feeding a certain percent of their crop to prairie restoration savanna, or hay that's from prairie. So they would have, like, if 20% or 30 or 50 or 60% of your product was coming from native plants, that they'd stamp that product and the consumer could work on it. Beef cattle can handle the hay very well. And so I've worked with some farmers down in southern Minnesota around Cannon Falls where the guy came out, we burned through it, so it's good, clean hay, there's no dead stuff in it. We cut it right at the bolt stage. It's solid stands of big blue stem, and we wanted to increase the diversity in there in interseed. And he took half the field. It was a 10-acre field. He took 5 acres. And I said, have it off site. 20 came back that weekend, Monday morning, and it was gone, perfectly done. I mean, like, this is great. We drilled it in. Now we're trying to get flowers in there. He came back the next year and he said, if you burn through that thing again, I'll take the other side if you want, or the same side that I took it this year. I said, Carl, we got a deal. And so I think education, like Dan's saying, and then we're trying to treat that. If we know we're going to hay it, we're trying to burn through it first. And we want, Dan talked about timing. We want to time it so it's a very valuable hay in these early successional sears, or like you're looking at right here. That's the second year and there's nothing really valuable for hay. So I'm thinking once we get these sites established to prevent them from going into just all big blue stem or giant patches or reed canary grass monocultures, etc., then we can start haying these systems, and the hay will be good for these beef producers especially. And if they can benefit financially from it through a branding system, restoration linked, boy, those are those reciprocal relationships that we need to build.
Can you talk a little bit about this is we have time for like one more question, but I'm going to sneak two in. About the usefulness of overseeding and in particular in combination with haying or mowing.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. I think on overseeding, so this is broad, Lori, very broad. So I'll kind of take it in a lot of different ways. But I think overseeding throughout the restorations, I know Steve, you do a great job of that with the dense swath seeding and maybe a fall, the next fall, like just multiple seed rains. So there's that. I think, when I think about overseeding too, one of the projects I'm super excited about, and I know Lori, you've been instrumental in this, but in absence of grazing and haying, like what's another way we can impact structure within the prairie and reducing big blue stem? And one of the things that I'm really interested in is trying to get more wood betony established, similar to the work that Nancy Breaker at Carleton's been doing and many others elsewhere. I also think about in some of these fields trying to get more coreopsis with thistle, northern bedstraw. Um, just and even Steve, you've presented this on species that do well in high nitrogen soils. Like that's another thing that I think about with overseeding. But yeah, seed as much as you can. Uh, yeah. Steve, do you have anything to add to it?
Yeah, I really like overseeding a couple 3 different seed rains. And just because sometimes certain species you want aren't available that year, or if they are, they're not very viable seed. You also get into these conditions where the seed comes up and then you go 3 weeks without rain, and so you get a big die off of a certain flush. Um, and so I think doing multiple seed rains, and again, if you're going to spend $800 an acre on seed, you can just chunk that out. You can also, we do in a lot of, and this is an herbicide thing here, but we do a lot of seeding in woodlands where it's thick buckthorn in it, where we will seed the graminoids, really diverse, like 27 different species of graminoids. That does allow us the opportunity to use an overspray for the broadleaf buckthorn in that case, or we could graze it, or we get instant fuels that we can burn through it type of situation. So seeding is more than a one-time thing for sure. And yeah, I think that's all I was. That's all I have on that. But yeah, like Dan said, seed often.